This program is presented by University of California Television. Like what you learn? Visit our website or follow us on Facebook and Twitter to keep up with the latest UCTV programs. Also, make sure to check out and subscribe to our YouTube original channel, UCTV Prime, available only on YouTube.
I'm Harry Chrysler of the Institute of International Studies. Welcome to A Conversation with History. Our guest is John R. Searle, who is Mills Professor of Philosophy at the University of California at Berkeley. Among his 10 books are Speech Acts, Expression and Meaning, The Campus Wars, Intentionality, The Rediscovery of the Mind, The Construction of Social Reality, and Minds, Brains, and Science, based on his acclaimed Reith lectures. He has taught at Cal for 40 years, and his works have been translated into 20 languages. Professor Searle, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you.
Where were you born and raised?
Well, I was born in Denver, and I lived there till I was 12, but because of the vagaries of the Second World War and the way people moved around then, I then lived in a lot of places. My father was an executive of AT&T. My mother was a medical doctor. And after we left Denver, I lived in New York, New Jersey, and Wisconsin, where I graduated from high school and where I went to my first university.
And how did your parents shape your character?
Well, that's not for me to say. I think a lot of people would think they didn't do a good enough job. But I certainly, a lot of things, I think now that my education was somewhat unusual, my upbringing was a bit unusual because my mother was a professional medical doctor. So I never had the problem that a lot of people have of finding it difficult to get used to women as equal members of the profession. I never had any doubts about that in my house. In fact, I sort of thought when I was a real little kid that professions like law and women really were more women's professions than they were. Like my dad was an engineer. And I think now that I'm a bit older and I can look back on it, I think a kind of wanting to know how things work has infected my philosophy, which I got from both of my parents, a kind of engineering approach to philosophical problems, and that's not entirely typical in my profession, I've discovered.
And what about your interest in science?
Well, the funny thing is, in a sense, I was reacting against science in high school and college. I didn't want to be a doctor, and I didn't want to be an engineer. I thought that the humanities were the more exciting parts of my education. But in fact, now I wouldn't make the distinction. Now it all comes together for me. I don't see any distinction between, let's say, mathematics, literature, and neurobiology. I now have a big enough scope and a big enough view of human intellectual enterprise that I don't make the distinction between these things. And I think my problem, as a problem for every philosopher, is to do philosophy well, you have to know everything. And I don't know everything. Neither does any other philosopher, and there's a bad inference from that. That is, it looks like we've got a built-in problem.
Still talking about your youth, any particular books that you read that turned you on that really made a difference?
Gosh, there must be hundreds.
But you read a lot.
Yes, much more then than I do now. I think Russell's History of Western Philosophy, when I read, when I was a teenager, is not a very good book, really. I mean, it's from a scholarly point of view. But it made it seem like these were real people doing real things. So it made it look like philosophy was a human activity. You didn't have to be a genius or some kind of monster to do it. So I think that had a big influence on me. But other obvious things like, Huckleberry Finn. I read it over and over, more or less every year. And every time I read it, it would seem like a different book to me. And it is a remarkable book. And then I started reading literature seriously when I was a teenager, and Proust. I read the great modernists, Proust and Joyce and Mann and Kafka, and they had a tremendous influence on me.
But you were reading things then probably that your cohorts weren't? You were ahead of the game? Or?
Well, I'm not sure that that was true. I had an unusual bunch of friends in high school and in college, and we were, now that I think about it, for 16-year-olds, we were pretty self-consciously intellectual. That is, we hated American popular culture. We had nothing to do with the culture of the 50s. We threw up when we heard Bing Crosby or Frank Sinatra. We just thought that was just dreck. We wanted nothing to do with that. And we were self-consciously intellectual in our interests. And I think that was healthy. I think it's healthy when you're, especially when you're young, to feel that you're different and unique and not just part of a great mass of people flowing forward. I think it's good to fight against the current.
And that's something that a philosopher is often doing, as we'll talk about in a few minutes.
I got used to being in a minority by the time I was 14 or 15. One thing I should say is I went to a very unusual school when we lived in New York. I went to the experimental school of Columbia University called Horace Mann Lincoln. And that, I have to say, at the age of 13 was the most intense intellectual environment I ever lived in, was when I was 13 years old. And these were very intense ninth graders. They were fanatically political. So as I was a Fabian socialist at the time, but I was sort of the class right-winger in the ninth grade, being merely a socialist. That was a remarkable atmosphere, and I think it did have an effect on me in the long run. For one thing, it gave me a kind of intellectual self-confidence in debate. You had to shout as loud as anybody else at Horace Mann Lincoln, or nobody, you were never heard.
So toughness went along with thinking in this environment.
I got used to arguing. I do not feel uncomfortable when people challenge my views. And I don't feel uncomfortable if it turns out I'm in a minority. That doesn't bother me.
Then as an undergraduate, you went to the University of Wisconsin.
That was my first university, yeah. And at the time, it was a wonderful place. I think all universities have lost some of that enthusiasm that they had in the early 50s, but I was part of what was called the Integrated Liberal Studies program, and they taught us Western civilization, roughly speaking, from the pre-Socratics right up to the present time, and it really was a marvelous intellectual environment.
And you were also in student government?
Yeah, I don't know how I got into that exactly, but in the way that you do, you find suddenly you're running for an office in student government, and I did.
And so you were president of the student body?
I was, yeah, but I'm afraid I disappointed a lot of people because I found I had a terrific conflict between being president of the student body and my intellectual interests, and in the end I resigned as president to pursue my studies. I had to make a choice, and I did.
And you were in philosophy as a major?
Well, I was in everything.
In everything.
You see, I mean, I hadn't settled on anything. Everything interested me, and it still does. I mean, this is part of my problem. Everything interests me. I go to the library to get a book on symbolic logic, and I find I'm reading about the war in the desert, or the development of ceramic pottery in Europe, or Byzantine art. Everything interests me.
But you want to bring order to
yeah,
this.
I do. Yes, I do. Maybe that's one of the reasons that I intellectually like to produce orderly books and an orderly theory, because inside it's all chaos.
Then you were a Rhodes Scholar and went to England to study for how many years?
Well, I got the Rhodes Scholarship in my junior year, and I was only 19, and I really was not very well formed. Now, I didn't know that at the time. I thought, I was a pretty old guy, pretty far along. Right. And when I got to Oxford, they treated me as if I had no education at all. And they made me start at the very beginning, because unlike other Rhodes Scholars, I didn't already have a degree, and consequently they said, well, you have to start at the beginning. So I took philosophy, politics, and economics, which was a standard degree, a standard combination. And that's when I first became professionally interested in philosophy. And then when I got my BA, well, in Oxford in those days, you could get a job. If you got a good BA, you could be hired. And I was, after some months after I got my BA, I got a job as a research, what's called a Don, a research lecturer at Christ Church, my old college. And so I stayed on for another 3 years. So I spent a total of 7 years in Oxford, my first visit. That is 3 years as an undergraduate, 1 year doing research, and then 3 years as a faculty member.
And then your first position in the United States at Berkeley?
Berkeley.
You came here in what year?
59, and I've been here since, 40 years.
59, 40 years, my goodness. Let's talk a little about doing philosophy.
Yeah.
Is it hard to do philosophy?
It's murder. Yeah, absolutely. And I compare it, if you really want to know how to do it, you get up in the morning, there's a large brick wall, and you run your head against that brick wall, and you keep doing that every day until eventually you make a hole in the wall. That's what it feels like.
But metaphorically, the wall has ceased to exist, right? Using the metaphor that you're always...
Unfortunately, I'm keep banging the wall, and then once I get one wall battered into shape, then I got to work on another one. Now, the way it actually works out is that you're constantly fighting with a whole lot of apparently contradictory ideas, and yet they all seem appealing, and you have to find some way to resolve them. So, take an obvious case. We're all conscious, and it's real, right? All you do is pinch yourself, and you know this is real. But how can matter be conscious? You know, what you got in your skull is about 1.5 kilograms, 3 pounds of this gook. It's about the texture of English oatmeal, slimier, and it's gray and white. And now how can this 3 pounds of gook in your skull, how can that have all these thoughts and feelings and anxieties and aspirations? How can all of the variety of our conscious life be produced by this squishy stuff blasting away at the synapses? I mean, there's 100 billion neurons, glial cells, synapses. How does that produce consciousness? And that is, that's typical of philosophical problems. Is on the one hand, you want to say, well, consciousness couldn't exist because, how does it fit in with a physical world? On the other hand, we all know it does exist. So you have to find some way to resolve that. That's a typical philosophical problem.
And this has been really a major research interest of yours.
Well, this one right now is, yeah. Most of my early career, I worked on language. My main research was about language and speech. My first 2 books were about the philosophy of language. But when I was writing those books, I kept using mental notions like belief and intention and desire and human action, and I knew someday I'd have to pay off that debt. I'd have to go and write a book about those sorts of things. So I did. I wrote a book called Intentionality. But that left open this whole range of traditional issues in the philosophy of mind. How does the mind work? How does it relate to physical reality? And I've written now several books about those issues, and something else happened. 2 things happened. One is consciousness became a fashionable subject. For the first, 20 or 30 years of my career, if you talked about consciousness, people thought, you're some kind of mystic or you're not serious. But that's changed now. Now it's a very exciting subject. And the second thing that happened was that cognitive science was created as a new discipline, and I was in on that. That was in the late 70s. Really in early 80s, that here in Berkeley and really all over the country, we created this new movement of cognitive science.
And as a philosophical issue, what is really exciting about this is it really touches on this whole division between the mind and the body, basically, which is something that philosophy has never really resolved. Is that
well? That's what I'm trying to resolve. That is what I'm trying to say. Is we need to get rid of the 17th century categories. We've inherited this vocabulary that makes it look as if mental and physical name different realms. And it's part of our popular culture. So we sing songs about your body and your soul, or we have sayings about how your mind is willing but your flesh is weak, and sometimes the other way around, the flesh is willing but the mind is weak. We have this, we have inherited, not only philosophically but in our religious tradition, we've inherited the idea that there are 2 quite distinct realms, the realm of the spiritual and the realm of the physical. And I'm fighting against that. I want to say we live in one realm, it's got all of these features, and once you see that, then the philosophical mind-body problem dissolves. You're still left with a terrible problem in neurobiology, namely, how does the brain do it in detail? What are the specific neurotransmitters? What's the neuronal architecture? But I think the philosophical problem, how is it possible that the mental can be a real part of a world that's entirely physical, I think that problem I can solve.
And how?
The way I solve it is to get rid of the traditional categories. Once you forget about Descartes' categories of res extensa and res cogitans, that is, the extended reality of the material and the thinking reality of the mental, once you get rid of the categories and you ask yourself how it works, then it seems to me there are 2 principles which, if properly understood, and it's not all that easy to understand them, but if properly understood, provide you with a solution to the traditional mind-body problem. Now, those principles are, first, all of our mental processes are caused by lower-level neuronal processes in the brain. We assume that it's at the level of neurons, but that's for the specialists to settle in the end. Neurons and synapses. Maybe you got to go higher, maybe you got to go lower. But some sorts of lower-level processes in the brain, whether it's clusters of neurons or subneuronal parts or neurons and synapses, their behavior causes all of your mental life. Everything, from feeling pains and tickles and itches, pick your favorite. Suffering the angst of post-industrial man under late capitalism, whatever's your favorite.
Or stubbing your toe.
That's right, stubbing your toe. Whatever's your favorite feeling. Feeling ecstatic at a football game, feeling drunk when you've had too much to drink, all of that is caused by variable rates of neuron firings in the brain or some other such neurobiological phenomenon we don't know in detail what. Okay, that's principle number one. Brains cause minds. All of our mental life is causally explained by the behavior of neuronal systems. Now, the second principle is just as important. The mental reality, which is caused by the neurobiological phenomena, is not a separate substance that's squirted out. It isn't some kind of juice that's squirted out by the neurons. It's just the state that the system is in. Mm-hmm. That is to say, the behavior of the microelements causes a feature of the entire system at a macro level, even though the system is made up entirely of those elements that cause the higher level behavior. Mm-hmm. Now, that's hard for most people to grasp, that you can that you can accept both that the relation between the brain and the mind is causal and that the mind is just a feature of the brain. But if you think about it, nature's full of stuff like that. Look at this glass of water, for example. It's liquid. Now, liquidity is a real feature, but the liquidity is explained by the behavior of the molecules. That is, the liquid behavior is explained by the behavior of the molecules, even though the liquidity is just a feature of the whole system of molecules. I can't find a single molecule and say, this one is liquid, this one's wet, I'll see if I can find you a dry one. Similarly, I can't find a single neuron and say this one is conscious or this one is unconscious. We're talking about features of whole systems that are explained by the behavior of the microelements of those systems. So I think the philosophical problem is resolved. That is, I don't have any worry about the philosophical mind-body problem. But the scientific problem, how exactly does the machinery do it? That's still very much up for grabs, and I'm in the middle of that battle as well, even though I'm not a neuroscientist. Okay, but now there are a whole lot of other philosophical problems left over, but that one I'm not worried about.
At one point in your one of your most recent books, you in passing throughout the book, make points about doing philosophy. That's my interpretation. Yeah. But at one point you say it's always good to remind ourselves of the facts.
That's right.
And what I want to add here is you said this was really exciting, and part of the excitement comes from doing this work at the same time that all these biological discoveries are being made.
That's right. You see, I think in philosophy especially, you have to remind yourself of what you know already. We know that the world is made up of entities that we call particles. They're not exactly particles, but that's close enough. It's made up of entities, molecules, atoms, subatomic particles. It's made up of these tiny entities, and they are organized into systems. And these systems have causal relations to other systems. So a planet is a system, and a water molecule is a system, a baby is a system. There are all these subsystems. And some of those systems have evolved through biological evolution. Some of them with carbon-based systems with a heavy dosage of hydrogen, nitrogen, and oxygen. And that's our life. We got a thing about these four elements. And those systems evolve across evolutionary time. Now, we know all of that. Now, some of those carbon-based living systems have evolved neuronal systems. Funny kind of cell, a neuron. It's a cell like any other, but it's different anatomically. And some of those neuronal systems cause consciousness. Start there. Now, that's how much we know before the philosopher ever goes to work. Then we go to work on that. We don't go back and think, well, maybe the real world doesn't exist. No, that's not an option. Mm-hmm. So you have to remind yourself of what you actually know.
At one point, you're trying to explain when we do philosophy. This is I can't remember which book this was in, but you say, as soon as we are confident that we really have knowledge and understanding in some domain, we stop calling it philosophy and start calling it science.
Yeah.
And as soon as we make some definite progress, we think ourselves entitled to call it scientific.
That's right. Yeah.
So this world you're in right now, that's part of the excitement.
That's
basically.
Right. That's right. You see, what happens is this. Philosophy is in part the name for a whole lot of subject matters that we really don't know how to settle the issues in those subject matters, where we don't have established methods for resolving questions. Now, for me, that's part of the fun. Mm-hmm. It's wide open. You're not hemmed in you're not trapped in a narrow little research program. But a lot of people find that uncomfortable, that you can't fall back on an established body of philosophical truths. Okay, now you have this wide open area, but as soon as we can get a question into a precise enough form that it admits of a systematic answer that everybody can see is right, we quit calling it philosophy. We call it science or mathematics or logic, and that's happened in a whole lot of questions. That happened to the problem of life. Mm-hmm. So at one time, how can inert matter be alive? That was a philosophical issue. Now it's very hard for us to remind ourselves how important that was. We can't recover the intensity with which our great-grandparents fought that question. Now we know how it works, and this, I think, will happen to the problem of consciousness. We will get a way of resolving it as a scientific question. This has a funny result for philosophers, namely, this is why science is always, quote, right, and philosophy is always, quote, wrong, because as soon as we're convinced that it's right, we quit calling it philosophy and call it science.
So once you have the method of coming up with the answers, it's time for you to close up shop, in a way, as a philosopher.
Once you have a method that all the competent researchers in the field, I mean, there are always a few cranks, but for the most part, that the competent researchers in the field can agree is the right method for resolving this problem, then it ceases to be a philosophical problem, and it becomes a problem in logic, or it becomes a problem in biology. So the question, how many carbon rings are there in serotonin, that's a neurotransmitter, that's not a philosophical question. But what's the relation of the mental and the physical, that's still a philosophical question. What's the cause of cancer? That's not a philosophical question. But what's the nature of causation? What is it for one thing to cause another thing anyhow? That's a philosophical question.
Now, when you think of coming to get a degree here and taking a philosophy course, I mean, it might be intimidating for a student. And at one point you say, we have to begin by approaching the problem naively. Yeah. We have to let ourselves to be astounded by facts that any sane person would take for granted. So in a way, this sense of wonder and naivety and innocence that you might have is a virtue in a way.
No, I mean that quite literally, and in fact, we've been exhibiting that in our discussion. The way that I describe the mind-body problem, I mean, it's a kind of, you have to allow yourself to be astounded by things that any sane person takes for granted. We got this stuff in our brains. It's conscious. How the hell can it be conscious? Now, that's the childlike question that you have to ask. When you begin working on a philosophical question, you have to be totally naive. I got this hole in my face. Noise comes out. People find it meaningful. They think it's true or false or interesting. How can that be? How can these, just making these noises through my mouth, how can that have all of these remarkable properties? That's the naive stage. Then you have, at some point, to become incredibly sophisticated. You stop being naive and become immensely knowledgeable, rigorous, and sophisticated. And I've never figured out the algorithm from when you stop being dumb and start being smart. But you have to start off very naive and very dumb. Oh, yeah, it's amazing. How can that be? Then later on, then you bring in your intellectual apparatus and get it resolved.
But and also you must have to immerse yourself in the studies, for example, in the case of what's going on in the mind that science is discovering.
Yeah, and the internet is a disaster.
I see.
Because it means there's more stuff than ever to read. and the proliferation of good articles. I can't read all the intelligent attacks on myself. There are just too many. And I can't read all my email. So the problem is that the amount of technology doesn't give us more time in the day. This is the real problem. And you have to read a lot, and I'm sure I don't read enough. But what I do read, I take very seriously.
Now, you've given us a sense of the domain in which you work, the kinds of problems you work on. What then are the traits that go with doing philosophy well? It sounds like you have to be very patient.
Yeah. Well, I'm not patient. I know that. I tend to get impatient. But let me describe some of the traits I think that make for a good philosopher. One is you really have to have a kind of openness. You can't think that you know all the right answers in advance. You've got to be willing to be astonished when you go to work on problems. And this has happened to me on a number of occasions. I mean, I'll give you one example. I knew all my life I'd someday have to write an article about metaphor. How do metaphors work? And like every American, I've been to high school. And like every American, I guess you think the stuff you learn in high school must at some level be right. In high school, they taught us all metaphors are really similes in disguise. It's really, when you say man is a wolf, you mean man is like a wolf in certain respects. And I just assumed that. And then I was astounded to discover that theory doesn't work. You can't make that theory work because, well, for a number of reasons it doesn't work. But that's an example of how you've got to be open. You've got to be willing to have your most fundamental beliefs challenged and even refuted. So that's the first thing. The second thing is you got to mind your P's and Q's. You've got to make sure that each step follows logically from the earlier steps. And now the third thing is, in a way, the hardest of all. You just have to avoid saying things that are obviously false. And you'd be surprised how many famous philosophers say things that are obviously false. I mean, Berkeley says the material world doesn't exist. It's all just ideas. A lot of contemporary philosophers say, well, the mind doesn't really exist. It's just a computer program, or it's a way we have of looking at things. And consciousness doesn't really exist. It's just a certain type of computer program. I would say if you can proceed rigorously, you have an open mind, and you avoid making obvious mistakes, avoid saying things that are obviously false. Well, I don't guarantee you a successful career in philosophy, but you're off and running. I mean, you're doing better than a lot of famous people.
And you have to be argumentative and courageous, right?
Yeah, I think it takes a certain amount of courage. If you have a view that you think is right, but an awful lot of people don't think it's right, and you publish it, and you turn on your email or you open the philosophy journals and you find out all these guys think you're wrong, you have to have if you really think you're right and you really have to have good arguments, you have to have the courage of your convictions. And some people find that difficult. I don't. I guess my upbringing or my personal style, I don't mind it if other people disagree with me. I'm sorry that they make these mistakes, but I do what I can to correct them.
In your work on the mind and the brain, you talk about how there is always a turn in an era to a metaphor that is dominant in technology, and then hence the dominant one now is to say that the mind is like a computer program. And to answer that, you've come up with the Chinese room.
Right.
Tell us a little about that.
Well, it's such a simple argument that I find myself somewhat embarrassed to be constantly repeating it, but you can say it in a couple of seconds. Here's how it goes. Whenever somebody gives you a theory of the mind, always try it out on yourself. Always ask, how would it work for me? Now, if somebody tells you, well, really, your mind is just a computer program, so when you understand something, you're just running the steps in the program. Well, try it out. Take some area which you don't understand, and imagine you carry out the steps in the computer program. Now, I don't understand Chinese. I'm hopeless. I can't even tell Chinese writing from Japanese writing. So I imagine that I'm locked in a room with a lot of Chinese symbols, that's the database, and I got a rule book for shuffling the symbols, that's the program, and I get Chinese symbols put in the room through a slit, and those are questions put to me in Chinese, and then I look up in the rule book what I'm supposed to do with these symbols, and then I give them back symbols, and unknown to me, the stuff that comes in are questions, and the stuff I give back are answers. Now, if you imagine that the programmers get good at writing the rule book, and I get good at shuffling the symbols, my answers are fine. They look like answers of a native Chinese person. They ask me questions in Chinese. I answer the questions in Chinese. All the same, I don't understand a word of Chinese. And the bottom line is, if I don't understand Chinese on the basis of implementing the computer program for understanding Chinese, then neither does any other digital computer on that basis, because no computer's got anything that I don't have. That's the power of the computer. It just shuffles symbols. It just manipulates symbols. So I am a computer for understanding Chinese, but I don't understand a word of Chinese. And again, you can see this point if you contrast Searle in Chinese with Searle in English. If they ask me questions in English and I give answers back in English, then my answers will be as good as a native English speaker, because I am one. And if they give me questions in Chinese and I give them back answers in Chinese, my answers will be as good as a native Chinese speaker, because I'm running the Chinese program. But there's a huge difference on the inside. On the outside, it looks the same. On the inside, I understand English and I don't understand Chinese. In English, I am a human being who understands English. In Chinese, I'm just a computer. Computers, therefore, and this really is the decisive point, just in virtue of implementing a program, the computer is not guaranteed understanding. Might have understanding for some other reason, but just going through the steps in the formal program is not sufficient for the mind.
And so the computer program then has not explained consciousness.
That's right. Nowhere near. Now, that isn't to say that computers are useless, we shouldn't use them. No, not a bit of it. I use computers every day. I couldn't do my work without computers. But the computer does a model or a simulation of a process. And a computer simulation of a mind is about like computer simulation of digestion. I don't know why people make this dumb mistake. You see, if we made a perfect computer simulation of digestion, nobody thinks, well, let's run out and buy a pizza and stuff it in the computer and get it to digest. Because it's a model. It's a picture of digestion. It shows you the formal structure of how it works. It doesn't actually digest anything. Mm-hmm. Now, that's what it is with the things that a computer does for anything. A computer model of what it's like to fall in love or read a novel or get drunk doesn't actually fall in love or read a novel or get drunk. It just does a picture or model of that.
Let's move now and talk a little about the university and how a philosopher looks at the goals of the university, but also the changes that have occurred at Berkeley. So this was your first position here, and shortly after you came, really the free speech movement started.
Right.
And you were involved in
Very
that.
much so.
Tell us about that. Tell us about that.
Well, okay, I will. That was a long story, and what happened was this. I am not basically a very political person. Given a choice between intellectual life and political life, I'd take intellectual life anytime. It's more fun in the long run. It's more satisfying. But when I came back from England, I was involved in civil liberties activities, and in particular, I was involved against the McCarthyite residues of the 50s. I was involved against something called the House Un-American Activities Committee, and I had, as an undergraduate at Wisconsin, been active against Senator McCarthy, who was then our senator from Wisconsin. I was secretary of an organization called Students Against McCarthy. So I kept that as a kind of sideline. And to my total amazement, I was forbidden to speak at our law school in response to a movie put out by the House Un-American Activities Committee. The chancellor's office called up the law school and said, that guy Searle is too controversial. You can't have him speaking unless you get somebody to reply.
Yeah.
This was a man named Vice Chancellor Cragen under Chancellor Strong who called up and forbade me to speak at the law school and invoked various stupid university rules, which the Kerr rules, he called them. Now, Clark Kerr assures me this was a misapplication of the rules, but at the time, they could shut off my free speech. And I can tell you, I did not appreciate that. I was extremely indignant that that had happened to me. I was an assistant professor in this university. I was invited to lecture in a law school class, and a Vice Chancellor Cragen in the Chancellor's office could call up and stop that lecture. So a couple of years after this incident, a bunch of students came to me and said, we are protesting the absence of free speech on the campus. We've got something called the free speech movement. And they found in me a sympathetic audience. I was extremely sympathetic to the idea that the university had a long way to go to assure complete freedom of speech. And in particular, I had a good student named Mario Savio, and I had a teaching assistant named Suzanne Goldberg. And they were the first people that I talked to about this student activities that was going on. I remember one day going out with Suzanne and seeing all these people surrounding a police car. Mm-hmm. I'd seen the most amazing scene. I mean, it wasn't like something out of the 1950s. So the first thing you know, I was busy making speeches on behalf of the FSM. I became very active. In fact, I guess I was the first tenured faculty member who really took the side of the students, and I was extremely active on the side of the FSM.
And what did you learn from that experience?
Yeah.
And obviously, the free speech movement became something entirely different over time.
Yeah, it did. Yeah. Well, there are a number of things that happened, all of which, most of which would have been unpredictable. The free speech movement, within its own initial objectives, was successful. We did change the university regulations, so the kind of thing that was done to me as an assistant professor couldn't be done after 1964, and I don't believe it could be done today. I may be wrong about that, but I don't think so. However, two other things happened that really we couldn't have predicted, and they were not so fortunate. One is we created a whole lot of radical expectations. This is characteristic of revolutionary movements, is people involved get a sense of enormous possibility. All kinds of exciting things are going to happen. We can create a new kind of a university. We can create a new kind of a society. It's all going to start right here in Berkeley. That's one thing that happened, was that we created unreasonable expectations about what could be achieved by a student movement of this sort. And a lot of people wanted to keep going after the FSM. They thought, we have this marvelous student movement here. We've got all this energy and idealism. It's very hard after you've had the heady and exhilarating triumph of overthrowing university administration to then go back to your classes and start doing homework and taking notes and writing term papers. A lot of people found that very hard. The second thing that happened was an issue came up that really made it impossible to carry on a normal civil life in the United States, and that was the Vietnam War. Mm-hmm. And that was really by the late 60s, from 66 afterwards, that it became progressively more difficult to run the university in the face of the amount of protests that went on against the Vietnam War. So the FSM, by providing an example of successful student protest, created imitators all over the United States, and it was possible for a lot of people to have the illusion that, well, we have created a national student movement, and this national student movement is going to have an enormous change, an enormous effect on the process of change in American life, at beginning with the Vietnam War. Now, I mentioned two things. Actually, there was a third thing that happened, and that is the set of totally dreadful vulgarizations of culture that occurred under the general name of the 60s. Mm-hmm. And in the 60s, people had a whole lot of really quite stupid theories about life. They thought you get immediate gratification through drugs. You get immediate, and indeed, if you can't get immediate gratification through drugs, then you get it through some other equally instantaneous form of gratification. The idea that satisfactions in life normally take a lot of work. You have to do years of preparation to do anything worthwhile. In the 60s, it was very hard to convince people of that.
Now, in your book on the campus wars, you look at some of the underlying structural conditions that made that, so to speak, weaken the immune system.
That's right,
To made it vulnerable to these issues like Vietnam. And you talk about there was a real generational difference, that these expectations were based in a society where many of the students had come from privilege and so on, unlike your generation. Before.
They were not Depression babies. I don't want to oversimplify this, but there was a psychological difference in the attitude of the students in the 60s and the attitude of the students in the 50s. Students in the 50s had been brought up in the Depression and had lived through the war, and they understood what it was to be economically insecure, and they understood what it was for the country to be threatened. But the students who arrived here in the 60s had grown up in an unparalleled period of prosperity and security in American life. They were afraid about the atomic war, but nobody really thought that the United States was a weak country or that we were economically desperate, whereas they did think that in the 1930s. We were quite desperate economically. So I don't want to, again, oversimplify this, but moral outrage is essentially a middle-class luxury. You have to feel pretty secure in your own personal status and existence in order that you can become morally outraged at injustices done to other people. And that was possible in the 60s in a way that it wasn't possible in the 50s.
And you, in your analysis of that period, you do believe that in many ways the major institutions, especially in the university, were unresponsive.
Yes, they were, yeah. Well, for a number of reasons. In part because they'd never seen anything like this. They were themselves creatures of the 20s, 30s, 40s, and 50s, and there hadn't been anything like the student protest movement of the 60s. Now you might say, well, what about the 30s? Didn't you have a lot of student activism in the 30s? There was a fundamental difference between the student protests of the 60s and earlier generations. And that you can state in one sentence. The student protesters of the 60s identified the university itself as an institution with the forces of evil that they thought themselves as fighting against. So in the 30s, students who were militating against fascism or who were trying to overthrow capitalism didn't think of the university as their enemy. But in the 60s, people who thought we are fighting for the liberation of the blacks or we're fighting against the war in Vietnam saw the university as the enemy, and the university was a much more vulnerable target than, let's say, the Pentagon. So whereas in the traditional student movement, if you had a national issue like foreign policy or the economic system, you didn't think of the university as the institution you should attack. And in the 60s, it was the institution that was attacked.
I have another question for you. I often heard that the first tier of leaders in the free speech movement was qualitatively better than the later tiers. Do you agree with that, since you mentioned that two of them were your students?
Well, I don't want to oversimplify it. What happened was this. The FSM became vulgarized, and that was bound to happen. Not all of the leaders of the FSM were first-rate intellectuals, but some of them were. Mario definitely was. Mario was a very good student by anybody's criteria. And I think it's, in a way, sad that he didn't have a normal intellectual career, because he certainly was capable of it. But there were a lot of people involved in the FSM, even in the early days, who I thought were opportunists, who were there as a way of seeking power or overcoming personal problems. What happened after the FSM, though, was not that there was a general decline in the IQ, but somehow or other this became, so to speak, an undergraduate career option. That is, it became something you could do as a student. And the role models had already been created, so all kinds of people who really hadn't paid their dues fighting Southern sheriffs and so on, as the original leaders of the FSM had, could then become prominent student radical leaders. Many of them weren't students, of course. They were just people who came to Berkeley, like Jerry Rubin. Jerry Rubin did not come here as a student. He came here after the FSM to try to get in on the activity. But there was a kind of opportunism and a sort of, I don't want to use the word careerism exactly because it's not a normal career, but a model of opportunity was created by the FSM that didn't exist before, and it attracted all sorts of mediocre people.
How do these events change the university and our understanding of what a good education is about?
Well, again, that's a very difficult question, and I will give really a rather too short and too inadequate an answer. One of the things that struck me in all of this period was how resilient the university was. We just went on with the sheer glacial force of academia with its budgets and its committees and its procedures for promotion to tenure. So at one level, it had, the university proved itself remarkably strong in fighting this stuff off. In this respect, American universities were better than European universities because we had a kind of self-confidence in the traditional institutional structures, and they just kept marching on. I think, for the most part, if somebody had gone to sleep in the 1950s and came back to the campus today, well, he'd be struck by the weird way students dress and the way the professors dress.
And how much they're making.
And how much they're making, for better or worse. But he would not be astounded by the system of courses, credits, lectures, exams, degrees, and so on. All of the basic apparatus remained unchanged. However, there were forces at work in the larger society that combined with the radicalism of the 60s that had, I think, a serious long-term, made serious long-term damage to the university.
And what was that damage?
Well, it's, again, very hard to summarize, but I would say the university became less self-confident in its elitism. See, by definition, a university has to strive for the best. If you're not striving for the best, you're not the best university. You're not doing all that you can. But the best means that some things are better than others. Some professors are better than other professors. Some books are better than other books. Some ideas are intelligent, other ideas are stupid. And a university has to be committed to quality. It's nothing mysterious. It's like the San Francisco 49ers. They try to get the best coaches and the best players and make them do the best they can. Well, we're supposedly trying to get the very best professors and the very best students, and that means intellectually the best, the intellectual elite of the country as the professors, and the intellectual elite of the state and people from out of state as the students, and make them perform at the highest possible level. Well, we're still committed to that, but we're more bashful about saying it in public. And there is a sort of an undercurrent that, well, maybe that's all a really kind of disguised power structure, and maybe it's all a sort of disguised oppression and colonialism, and we got to get out of this idea that some books are really superior to others, and some students are superior to others, and some professors are better than others. And that's bad. I mean, if you don't believe in quality, and you don't believe that the ultimate criterion of success in this game is what's better and what's worse, what has the quality and what lacks the quality, then you've given up on the ideal of academic life. And I think, I don't want to overstate this, I don't want to say we've abandoned our elitism, but we're less self-confident than we were in the 50s and the 60s.
You've written that traditionally one of the aims of humanistic education was to get the student to overcome the accidents of his or her background. You are invited to redefine yourself as an individual in light of a universal human civilization and cultural tradition. And then you go on to say emphasis was on the individual within the universal. Now you derive your identity not from individual efforts at self-definition, but rather from the group to which you belong.
Yeah. Well, now this is a particular manifestation of what I was talking about, and I think in a way it's the worst single manifestation of this, is that we have abandoned the idea that the university invites the student to become part of a universal community of scholars, a part of a universal community of human civilization, where you achieve individual self-definition through participating in a universal human civilization. Now what we tell you is, what's your ethnicity? What's your race? What's your gender? That's who you are. You don't define yourself. You are defined by race, gender, class, ethnicity, and cultural background. And that isn't just stupid, that's evil. I'm fighting against that, but I think a lot of people now accept that. They think that's perfectly legitimate. And one way to put it is to say that traditionally in America, such things as that were regarded as accidental. You know, it's like you're blue-eyed or you're left-handed. You don't build your life around being left-handed. And you don't build your life around your ethnicity or your race. These are just stupid accidents of your birth. The serious professional intellectual regards it as an accidental fact. that he or she was born of a particular race or particular gender. You create yourself as an individual intellect, and that's what counts. And we will invite you into membership into a universal human community of advanced culture. And within that community, you can create yourself as a serious individual. But now we're telling otherwise innocent children, look, you came from this background, that's who you really are. And I think that is to say that is to abandon one of the fundamental advantages of the university education. Namely, before we told you, yeah, okay, you came from this background, you can be proud of this background, we'll offer you something better. We'll let you redefine yourself in giving you the resources of the whole of human history to redefine yourself. Now we've even got this stupid ethnic studies requirement where we make people study American cultures where the idea is you're supposed to celebrate various forms of quite ordinary phenomena. There's nothing intellectually special about having been born of a certain race or a certain gender.
Now, given your background, you said your mother was a doctor, and so you were used to a liberal environment that might have not been traditional. So what I'm curious about, you would agree, though, that the canon of West needed to be expanded to a certain extent. I mean, but the problem became something else, is what you're saying.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I never quite believed that there was a thing called the canon. There was something called the classics.
Yeah.
And the idea was that there were a collection of works of human civilization that, because of their intellectual quality or their historical importance, or both their intellectual quality and importance, were regarded as an essential part of education. So Plato is both important historically and has high intellectual quality. Marx is certainly important historically. You can have debates about the intellectual quality of the work, but both of those are important for people to read. But the idea is that we are conveying to you a human civilization with a number of cultural and intellectual achievements of quality and importance. And now that's challenged. Now the idea is, oh, well, one book's as good as another. I debated a guy once at another university who said, well, you know, Bugs Bunny's as good as Shakespeare. I mean, these are all just texts. One text is as much of a text as another text. And indeed, one English department at one university said, we really shouldn't call ourselves the Department of English Language and Literature. We should be called the Department of Textual Studies. And from the point of view of textual studies, well, I mean, a cereal box is as good as a sonnet by Shakespeare. It's all just, I mean, some nonsense you can only say in French. C'est la textualité du texte. It's all just a certain kind of textuality is all that counts. So that, I think, is, you see, that isn't just stupid, it's self-destructive, because if you don't believe that there's a distinction in quality, then why on earth would the taxpayers pay you? Why would the students pay you to teach this stuff if one opinion's as good as another and one text is as good as another? That is, I think that the mission that we're engaged in is predicated on a belief in quality.
And teaching students how to think.
Well, absolutely, but there are different ways of thinking, and you can't just teach a student how to think like that. You got to teach them how to think in a sensitive and critical fashion about interpreting poetry. You got to teach them how to think rigorously in analyzing philosophical arguments. You got to teach them to think in the lab about how to conduct a lab experiment. So the idea that it's, you see, if we just say, well, our method is teaching people how to think, then it seems like these courses that consist of just bull sessions are as good as anything else. People sit around and talk about their upbringing and how they felt oppressed and what their community was like and so on. That is not, in my opinion, a serious form of intellectually rigorous thinking. That's sort of a self-congratulatory introspection.
And part of education is getting beyond that.
Exactly. That part of education, the way I teach it, is I teach the student to overcome the accidents of their background, to think about things they would never have thought about otherwise. In high school, nobody teaches you about, I mean, unless it's a most remarkable high school, various neurobiological approaches to solving the problem of consciousness. I mean, that's something you have to get to an advanced level in order to be able to reflect on.
What do you hope to impart to your students once they've had John Searle? What do you want them to have taken away?
Yeah, a whole lot of things. There's always the immediate objective of the course. You should understand from this course how language works, if it's a course in the philosophy of language. And you should understand the predominant theories, the dominating theories about how language works. But I'm not bashful at telling you which theories I think are right. I mean, I'll teach you the other guy's theories, but I'm not concealing from you my own opinions. But you go away from this course, you should know that. You should understand the material of the course. And then you should have acquired a certain kind of a disciplined practice of reading and studying in the course, of reading the articles and writing the term papers and preparing for the exam. And really, if I'm successful, then you ought to be able to go and read the latest philosophy journals and read articles and read the latest stuff on this. I mean, I tell my students that if I'm successful in the course, they should, in an undergraduate course, they should be able to pass a PhD qualifying exam in this course, in the philosophy of language or the philosophy of mind, which are two courses I teach. However, having said all that, I have to say I think the most important thing that I try to convey, and the most important thing any professor can convey, is to exemplify a style of thinking and a mode of sensibility. It's what you provide an example of that is as important and in some ways more important than what you actually say explicitly. It's you convey by example what it's like to actually engage in a process of investigation and research, what it's like to formulate ideas and have them challenged by other ideas and then deal with the conflicts of these ideas. So the style that you exemplify, the mode of sensibility you express, I think is as important as the content of the course. Now, you don't want to get too self-conscious about that. You don't want to go into class thinking, well, you know, today I've got to really exemplify this. You do your thing. But at the end of the semester, if you ask yourself, or even more importantly, 10 years later, when the student comes back to the campus, if you ask yourself, what difference could I have made to these students, I think that's as important as the content of the course.
And is there something that students can do to prepare for the next millennium?
Work hard. You see, what I've found about Berkeley students in particular is that they hunger for commitment. And what they want to know from the professor is, does this material matter to you? Are you really intellectually committed to this material? And they are remarkably instinctive at spotting phonies, at spotting fake commitments or various forms of intellectual concealment. I think there's a kind of instinctive ability to spot this. And they're looking, Berkeley students are looking for commitment, and they hunger for intellectual commitment. And not everybody does. When I've taught at other universities, I teach at a lot of universities, and at some universities I've taught at, you get students who their IQs are as high as the Berkeley students. They're just more apathetic. They just don't much care about it. They don't have the hunger for commitment. They don't have the passion that I find in my Berkeley students.
Professor Searle, thank you for taking time to be with us today and giving us a sense of the habits of critical thinking.
Well, thank you very much for having me.
Thank you. And thank you very much for joining us for this conversation with history.
You've been listening to a podcast from University of California Television. For more information about this and other UCTV programs, visit us online at www.uctv.tv.